Don King walked into the room like he owned it, which in 1984 wasn't far from the truth. He had promoted Muhammad Ali. He had promoted George Foreman. He had built his entire career on finding the biggest names in the world and squeezing every dollar out of them before anyone realized what had happened. When the Victory Tour landed on his desk, he didn't see a family of musicians. He saw a fight card. "These boys are my fighters now," he told people in his circle. Not quietly. Don King never said anything quietly. The plan was straightforward from his perspective. The Jackson family was the hottest act on the planet after Thriller. The album had sold 40 million copies. Michael Jackson's face was on every magazine cover, every television screen, every conversation happening in the music industry. All Don King had to do was attach himself to that momentum and let the money follow. What he hadn't planned for was Michael Jackson himself. The Victory Tour was announced in late 1983. On paper, it looked like everything it was supposed to be: a reunion of the original Jackson lineup, a celebration of the Thriller era, a massive American stadium run that every promoter in the country would have given anything to control. But behind the scenes, the arrangement had already started going wrong before a single ticket was sold. Don King wanted to charge $30 per ticket. In 1984, that number was aggressive in a way that was hard to explain away. Most major concerts were priced between $15 and $20. 30 meant something very specific. It meant the person running this tour wasn't thinking about the fans. He was thinking about margins. The backlash came quickly. Consumer groups called it price gouging. Radio DJs told their listeners to think twice. Even journalists who had spent years covering Michael Jackson couldn't find a way to defend the logic. The tour hadn't started yet, and it was already a story for the wrong reasons. Michael's manager at the time, Freddie DeMann, pushed back hard. He understood something Don King seemed unwilling to consider. Michael Jackson's entire relationship with his audience was built on something that felt personal, something that felt earned. Putting a $30 wall between Michael and the people who had followed him since he was 9 years old wasn't just a bad business decision. It was a direct contradiction of what made him who he was. Don King didn't spend much time on contradictions. He spent time on gross revenue. The argument inside the camp escalated. Joe Jackson, who had his own financial arrangement with Don King, sided with the promoter. That put Michael in a position that was harder than it looked from the outside. His own father was on the other side of the table. The people who were supposed to have his interests at heart were the ones pushing the thing he fundamentally disagreed with. Michael went quiet. People who knew him well understood what that meant. When he was comfortable, he was impossible to miss. Dancing through hotel corridors at 2 in the morning, stopping to talk with stagehands, humming something new that hadn't made it onto a record yet. When something was wrong, he pulled back entirely. He'd still show up. He'd still give you the smile when a camera was pointed at him. But the people who had worked with him long enough knew the difference between Michael being present and Michael simply being in the room. In the months leading up to the first show, he was mostly just in the room. Don King read the silence as agreement. He kept scheduling press conferences where he stood at the center of every photo. He kept talking to journalists as if the tour was his creative vision made real. He was constructing a narrative in which Don King had looked at the Jackson family and seen their potential before anyone else did, and now he was delivering them to the world. Freddie DeMann watched this happen and understood exactly what it was. Don King wasn't promoting a tour. He was building a brand on top of someone else's name. Every press conference was another brick in a wall that had Michael's face on the outside and Don King's fingerprints on everything inside. The problem was that the contracts existed. The dates were booked. The machine was already moving, and there was no clean way to stop it. So the tour began. July 6, 1984. Gator Bowl, Jacksonville, Florida. The first night of the Victory Tour. Don King was backstage in a white suit that made sure nobody missed him. He was shaking hands, accepting congratulations, positioning himself in the center of every conversation. From his point of view, opening night was his achievement. He had assembled the pieces, negotiated the venues, handled the logistics, protected the business. The tour existed because he had made it exist. He believed that completely. Then Michael Jackson walked onto the stage. There's a specific thing that happens in a stadium when a performer steps into the light and 50,000 people stop doing whatever they were doing. It's not the same as regular crowd noise. Regular crowd noise is something you can manufacture with the right production team and enough pyrotechnics. What happened in Jacksonville that night was different. The audience didn't just react to Michael appearing under the spotlight. They responded to him in a way that felt almost involuntary, like a reflex. The opening notes of "Wanna Be Startin' Something" came through the speakers. Backstage, Don King stopped talking mid-sentence. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of small things happening in sequence over the first 10 minutes of the show. The way the crowd moved when Michael moved. The way they went completely still during certain moments and then erupted at exactly the beat Michael's body indicated they should. The call and response between one person on a stage and 55,000 people who had handed the next 2 hours entirely over to him. Don King had spent his career around fighters. The dynamic in boxing was always clean. The crowd was there to watch, and the athlete was there to perform. Two separate things occupying the same space for a defined period of time. That wasn't what was happening in front of him. The crowd wasn't watching Michael Jackson. They were with him. Those are not the same thing, and the difference matters more than it sounds. By the time Billie Jean started, someone standing near Don King noticed that the promoter had gone completely still. Whatever he had expected to see when he booked this tour, this specific version of it hadn't been part of the calculation. The shows continued through the summer and into the fall. 55 concerts across American stadiums. Venues that had never sold out inside 24 hours doing exactly that. The $30 ticket controversy faded because the people who paid that price forgot they were angry the moment the lights went down. There was a show in Kansas City where the power cut out for 11 seconds during the set. 11 seconds of complete darkness inside a full stadium. Any other performer would have lost the room. Michael stood where he was and waited. When the lights came back, he picked up exactly where he'd stopped. The crowd reacted louder than they had at any point before the outage. 11 seconds of silence, and he came out of it with more momentum than he'd gone in with. The crew talked about it for days. Don King was present for much of it. He kept talking to the press. He kept placing himself at the center of interviews. But somewhere in those months, the story started moving away from him. Because Michael was doing something Don King hadn't written into the contract. He was talking to the fans, not in press releases, not in formal statements. On stage, between songs, in small moments that cameras sometimes caught and sometimes didn't. He'd stop and hold a hand over the security barrier. He'd change the tempo of a song based on what the audience was sending back to him. He'd acknowledge one specific person in a crowd of 50,000 people in a way that somehow made all 50,000 feel seen. None of it was in the promoter's plan. All of it was making Don King's version of this tour look like a container that Michael had quietly decided to use for something else entirely. The final numbers came in at $75 million. Don King had delivered the gross revenue he promised. By any financial measure, the Victory Tour was exactly what he said it would be. Then Michael made his announcement. His personal share of the tour proceeds was going to charity. 4 organizations: the United Negro College Fund, the T.J. Martell Foundation for Cancer Research, Camp Ronald McDonald for Children with Cancer, and Meharry Medical College. Every dollar. All of it. Don King found out the same way everyone else did, through the press. Think about what that single decision did to the narrative Don King had spent months building. He had turned the Victory Tour into a commercial product, fought over ticket prices, positioned himself as the architect of the whole enterprise. And Michael Jackson, without a press conference or a dramatic statement, had quietly reframed what the entire thing meant. The tour wasn't about money. It had never been, from Michael's side. Don King had spent months promoting a revenue machine. Michael had been using it as something that didn't have a name in a promoter's vocabulary. The last thing Michael said publicly about the Victory Tour was brief. He said it was the last time he would perform with his family. That sentence ended Don King's leverage before he had a chance to respond to it. His entire value in the equation had rested on one specific version of Michael Jackson. Michael plus brothers. Michael as part of a family act. Michael inside the victory framework Don King controlled. That version was done. What followed was bad, then dangerous, then history, solo records, solo tours, a solo career that made everything that came before it look like preparation. Don King was not part of any of it. He went back to boxing, where the rules were clearer and the fighters didn't redirect their salaries to charity without telling him first. He had Mike Tyson by then, which was enough to keep him occupied. But if you ask anyone who was around during the victory tour about the actual dynamic between the promoter and the performer, they'll give you a version of the same answer. Don King thought he had signed a fighter. He had actually handed a microphone to someone who had no interest in being packaged, managed, or defined by anyone else's version of what he should be. The loud suits, the press conferences, the carefully positioned photographs, all of it turned out to be backdrop. Most people who were at those shows don't connect Don King's name to the victory tour without being prompted. They remember Jacksonville. They remember whichever city they were in when Michael stepped to the edge of the stage and did something no production budget could have manufactured. Don King gave Michael a platform. Michael used it for something Don King didn't have a framework for understanding. Years later, journalists who covered that period would sometimes ask people who had worked on the victory tour what the atmosphere was like when Don King was around. The answers were usually some version of the same thing. That Don King was always the loudest presence in any room he entered, right up until Michael walked in. At that point, Don King became background. That's not an insult. It's just a description of what happened when those two people occupied the same space. One of them had built a career on commanding attention. The other one had been commanding it since he was 6 years old, and he'd had a lot more practice. That gap between what the promoter thought he was controlling and what was actually happening on that stage. That's the whole story. It just took the full tour for anyone standing on Don King's side of it to see it clearly.